There is a specific moment that no one warns you about when you look at the people who raised you and realize you can no longer fit into the person they need you to be. Not because you have become cold, not because you love them less, but because something in you has genuinely grown past the container they built. The family identity, the role, the name, the set of expectations that was assigned before you were old enough to question any of it, has become too small. And the process of growing beyond it is not clean, it is not simple. It carries a shadow that most accounts of psychological development either minimize or ignore entirely. That shadow is what this video is about. What Jung's framework offers on the question of family identity is not primarily a theory of dysfunction. It is not a framework for identifying toxic families or cataloging the ways parents fail their children. It is something more structurally precise than that. In Jung's understanding, every family system produces a set of identities for its members, a set of roles, expectations, and narratives about who each person is and what they are permitted to become. These identities are not always consciously assigned. They emerge from the invisible architecture of the family psyche, from what the system needs to maintain its equilibrium, from the shadow material that no one has processed, from the wounds that were passed down without being named. Before the individual has any capacity for conscious choice, this identity begins to shape the person who will inhabit it. What makes the Jungian analysis of family identity categorically different from simpler accounts of family influence is its understanding of how deeply the assigned identity is internalized. The child does not simply perform the family's role, they become it. The identity the system assigns does not remain external. It is absorbed into the structure of the ego itself, becoming the foundation on which the conscious personality is built. This means that when the individuation process, the developmental movement toward one's own actual nature, begins to carry the person beyond that foundation, what is encountered is not only the family's external resistance, it is the internal resistance of the ego to the dismantling of its own deepest structures. The difficulty of outgrowing a family identity is, in this sense, a confrontation with yourself as much as with the system that formed you. If you're navigating the space between who your family built you to be and who you are actually becoming, subscribe to this channel. This is where that work lives, and where we keep going deeper into it together. The word outgrow in this context deserves examination, because in psychological terms it means something precise. To outgrow a family identity is not to reject one's family. It is not to declare the assigned identity wrong or false, or the family system malicious. It is not even necessarily a conscious decision. It is a developmental reality, the natural consequence of the individuation process proceeding as the psyche is designed to proceed. The psyche has a built-in orientation toward the fullest possible expression of its own nature. When the family identity is congruent with that nature, development proceeds without significant friction. When the family identity is organized around something other than, or in active conflict with, the individual's actual nature, growing past it becomes unavoidable. Not a choice. A psychological necessity whose timeline cannot be negotiated. But here is what most accounts of this process leave out, and what makes the Jungian framework uniquely equipped to address it. The difficulty of outgrowing a family identity is not primarily the family's resistance to your growth. That resistance is real and it matters. But the deeper difficulty, the one that makes this process genuinely disorienting and psychologically costly in ways that surprise even those who understand it intellectually, is the shadow dimension. The shadow that was built into the family identity itself. The shadow that the family now projects onto the person who is growing beyond what they were assigned to be. And the shadow that gets activated within the individuating person's own relationship to their growth. Without understanding this shadow dimension, the individuation from the family tends to produce not freedom, but a different kind of captivity. The starting point for understanding how the family identity is formed and why it has the psychological weight it does is Jung's application of what he called participation mystique. Drawn from the anthropologist Levi Brühl, this concept describes a condition of unconscious psychological merger in which the boundaries between individual and collective have not yet been clearly established. In the context of the family, participation mystique is the default condition of early childhood. The child does not begin life with a clearly differentiated individual identity. The child begins embedded in the family psyche, sharing its emotional tones, absorbing its unconscious material, experiencing itself as continuous with the collective rather than separate from it. The family identity is not assigned to a pre-existing individual. In a very real psychological sense, it is what the individual initially is, before the differentiation that development gradually makes possible. The persona, one of Jung's most practically significant concepts, is the social mask the individual develops to negotiate the demands of the environment. Within the family context, the persona is the specific face the individual learns to present to maintain the system's approval, coherence, and equilibrium. For some members, the family persona is the responsible one, the achiever, the emotional anchor. For others, it is the problem child, the volatile one, the one who never quite arrives. These two are persona assignments, negative in content but still serving the family's psychological economy. What is critical to understand about the family persona is that it is not simply performance. The child who is always the responsible one does not merely act responsible, they genuinely experience themselves as responsible. The persona and the ego become fused in ways that are not visible to the person inside them, and not easily separated once the fusion is complete. The family identity does not only define what the individual is permitted to be, with equal force it defines what the individual is not permitted to be. Every family system carries a shadow, a collection of qualities, emotions, drives, and capacities that the family's conscious identity cannot accommodate and therefore excludes. This excluded material does not disappear. It is distributed among the members of the system. The black sheep carries the non-conformity the family cannot acknowledge. The identified patient carries the distress the system cannot process. The golden child carries the unlived potential the parents never fulfilled in themselves. In each case, the individual is not simply performing a role. They are metabolizing the family's unprocessed psychological material on behalf of a system that cannot hold it in any other way and has, therefore, assigned it to the person least able to resist the assignment. The family, in Jung's understanding, is not simply a collection of individuals who happen to share a household and a history. It is a living psychic system, a field of shared unconscious material, mutual projections, and distributed psychological functions that operates with its own internal logic. Like any system, it is organized around homeostasis, the maintenance of its existing equilibrium. This systemic quality is essential to understanding why one member's growth produces responses that can seem disproportionate to what is happening on the surface. When a member of the system begins to change, begins to inhabit a self that does not conform to the role the system's equilibrium requires, the system responds, as systems do, with pressure toward the previous state. The response is not calculated, it is reflexive, and it can be powerful precisely because it comes from the entire field rather than from any single person. Jung's framework offers a specific and practically useful way of understanding the identified patient phenomenon, the member of the family system who appears, to everyone including themselves, to be the source of the system's problems. In the Jungian understanding, this person is not simply the weakest link or the most troubled individual in an otherwise functional system. They are the carrier of the system's shadow, the unconscious material that the rest of the family cannot acknowledge in themselves and has collectively organized around this one member to hold. The identified patient's visible difficulty, the behavior that draws concern, the struggle that becomes the family's focus, is, in this framework, not only personal pathology, it is the system's shadow made visible through a single designated vessel. And when this person begins to heal, begins to individuate, the system experiences what it cannot easily bear, the loss of its shadow receptacle. How does the family identity move from being an external assignment to becoming internal structure? The mechanism is less dramatic than it might appear. It operates through the accumulation of thousands of micro-interactions across the years of development, the way a child's specific emotional expressions are received or received poorly, the stories the family tells about who this person is and what they are like, the invisible reinforcement of behaviors that serve the system's needs, and the equally invisible dampening of behaviors that disturb its equilibrium. Over time, these accumulated interactions produce something in the individual that functions not as performance, but as genuine conviction, the conviction that this is who they are. The assigned identity is not experienced as assigned. It is experienced as true, and this is precisely what makes its eventual outgrowing so psychologically complex. Because what is being grown beyond is not merely something that was imposed. It is something that, at some level, was genuinely inhabited. When one member of a family system begins the movement of individuation, begins, in whatever way the process initiates, to become someone the system did not plan for, the system's response is not passive. It compensates. The compensation can take many forms. Increased emotional pressure on the individuating member to return to their assigned role, the sudden emergence of crisis in another member of the system that redirects attention away from the one who is changing, a collective narrative shift that reframes the individuation as something other than growth. What is important to understand about this compensation is that none of it is calculated. The family members who participate in it are not conspiring. They are responding to an unconscious systemic pressure that is as real and as powerful as any force operating in the interpersonal field. And that is organized not by individual intention, but by the system's drive toward its own preservation. And this is where what you might have understood intellectually about family dynamics meets something you can actually feel. Because the system's compensation does not arrive only from outside, it arrives from inside. The guilt, the sudden self-doubt at the moment of growth, the sense that to change is to betray, these are not simply personal weaknesses. They are the system's reach, internalized, and recognizing them as that is the beginning of navigating them consciously. If this is naming something you have been living, the way growth in you can feel like betrayal of them, write in the comments, "I am becoming who I was always meant to be." That declaration is not defiance. It is the first conscious step. The developmental timing of individuation from the family identity is not arbitrary. In Jung's framework, the early stages of psychological development require the container that the family identity provides. The child's ego is not yet strong enough to sustain itself without the scaffolding of the family system, its roles, its emotional atmosphere, its confirmation of who the child is and what they can expect from the world. The psychological differentiation that individuation requires does not become possible until the ego has developed sufficient strength to hold itself without external reinforcement. This is why the process tends to become unavoidable in early adulthood, and why it so frequently feels, from the inside, as though something is going wrong rather than something finally going right. The movement beyond the family identity is rarely a gradual drift. It is almost always catalyzed, set in motion by something specific that makes the discrepancy between the assigned identity and the actual self impossible to continue holding without acknowledgement. A relationship that opens dimensions of the person the family never had a category for. A vocational calling that does not map onto any role the family's world recognizes. A sustained encounter with genuine philosophical, psychological, or spiritual understanding that reorganizes the interior in ways the surface-level family identity cannot accommodate. A period of suffering that forces a depth that the persona was not built to contain. Whatever the specific catalyst, the effect is consistent. The individual becomes unable to fully inhabit the assigned identity in the way they previously could. The gap becomes undeniable. From the perspective of a family system, the individuation of one of its members is not experienced as growth, it is experienced as disruption. The psychological role that member occupied, the specific way they served the system's unconscious economy, the particular shadow material they carried, the emotional function they performed, is being vacated. This produces responses that range, depending on the family's flexibility, from gentle concern to overt hostility. What all these responses share is that they are not primarily about the individuating person. They are about the system's experience of losing what it relied on this person to provide. The family does not think, our member is growing and we are threatened by it. The family feels a disturbance it cannot fully account for and responds to that disturbance in the ways its own character makes available. Among the most psychologically sophisticated mechanisms that family systems use to prevent individuation, without any awareness that this is what they are doing, is the production of guilt. Not guilt in the moral sense, but guilt as a psychic reaction to the perceived betrayal of the family's implicit contracts about who each person will be. The person who is outgrowing their family identity does not simply encounter the family's expressed disappointment. They encounter in their own interior a guilt response that the system has cultivated, through years of subtle reinforcement, as its primary self-regulating mechanism. This guilt is experienced not as an external accusation, but as an internal verdict. It says, to grow is to abandon, to become is to betray. And it is one of the most consistent and most insidious obstacles that the individuation from the family must navigate. The shadow of individuation, the specific dimension that this video is named for, and that most frameworks for understanding family development either minimize or miss entirely, is not simply the difficulty that the process encounters. It is a precise category of psychological content. It includes 3 distinct layers, each of which requires its own form of engagement. The first is the shadow that the family identity required the individual to suppress, the qualities, capacities, and dimensions of experience that the assigned role could not accommodate, and that therefore developed in the unconscious rather than in the conscious life. The second is the shadow that the family projects onto the individuating person from outside. And the third, the one most important and most frequently overlooked, is the shadow operating within the individuating person's own relationship to their growth. All 3 must be understood for the process to produce genuine transformation rather than a different form of constraint. Every family identity requires suppression of something. The qualities the family cannot accommodate, the emotional ranges it cannot hold, the drives it cannot sanction, the dimensions of experience that fall outside its conscious self-concept, do not simply fail to develop in the child assigned to that system. They develop underground. They become shadow. The child required by the family to be perpetually composed develops in the shadow a substantial store of grief and fury and existential weight that was never permitted a voice. The child required to be the family's beacon of promise Develops in the shadow the terror of being ordinary and the longing to be allowed to fail without catastrophic consequence. When the individuation from the family identity begins, what surfaces first is frequently not the freedom the person expected. It is the shadow material, often in its rawest, least integrated form, that the identity was organized to contain. The shadow does not remain static within the individual who developed it. In Jung's framework, it is projected, cast outward onto others, and experienced as perception rather than as the projection it is. The family system, encountering one of its members who is individuating beyond the assigned role, is confronted with its own shadow in ways it has not requested and cannot easily manage. The individuating person's growing authenticity is a mirror the family did not ask to hold. Their increasing psychological depth contrasts against the family's surface-level identity in ways that cannot be comfortably ignored. Their willingness to question what the family has treated as unquestionable activates, in members who are not yet individuating, the shadow of their own unlived possibilities. And the most consistent response to this activation is projection. The individuating person becomes, in the family's unconscious field, the problem, the difficult one, the one who has changed, the one who has become something the family does not recognize. The narrative shift that families produce around a member who is individuating is one of the most consistent and most psychologically precise phenomena that the Jungian framework predicts. The individual who is genuinely growing becomes, in the family's story about itself, the one who has changed in a way that is implicitly or explicitly framed as loss rather than gain. You used to be so easygoing. I don't know who you are anymore. You've become so distant. You've changed. These statements are not simply interpersonal reactions to a person who has become less available or less agreeable. They are the system's attempt to re-assimilate the individuating member back into the role the system requires. The accusation is not personal. It is systemic. And recognizing it as systemic is not the same as dismissing it. It is the specific distinction that makes it possible to respond to without being undone by it. One of the most structurally significant features of family systems that are organized around the suppression of individuation is what might be called the double bind of growth. The double bind operates like this. The family communicates in various ways that the member should mature, develop, become capable and independent. These are the stated values. But when the development actually occurs, when the maturity produces a person who has genuinely grown beyond what the family's architecture was built to accommodate, the growth is responded to as a problem rather than as the fulfillment of the stated value. The message the individuating person receives is, in effect, grow, but not in a way that changes who you are to us. Become yourself, but only to the degree that who you become remains recognizable as who we needed you to be. This double bind is not consciously produced. It is one of the most psychologically costly features of systems organized around the containment of their members' development. The shadow of individuation from the family has a dimension that extends beyond the individual and the immediate family system, the ancestral shadow. Jung's framework and subsequent developments of analytical psychology has attended carefully to the degree to which the psychological material that an individual carries is not only personal in origin, it is, in significant part, the accumulated unprocessed material of the generations that preceded them, the wounds that were not healed, the grief that was not metabolized, the capacities that were not permitted expression, the identities that were assigned across generations before arriving, concentrated and crystallized in the individual who is now individuating. To outgrow a family identity in the fullest sense is not merely to move beyond what one's parents assigned. It is to interrupt, to the degree that individual consciousness and interior work can interrupt, a transmission that may have been running for generations without examination. What happens when the identified patient, the designated carrier of the family's shadow, refuses the role? When the person who was organized by the system to hold the collective's darkness begins to individuate, to heal, to integrate, rather than simply perform the assigned dysfunction? The answer in Jung's framework is that the shadow does not disappear. It shifts. Another member of the system begins to display what was previously concentrated in the one who is now becoming unavailable as a vessel. Or the system escalates its pressure on the individual to return, producing the family crisis, the emergency, the urgent need that functions to pull the individuating member back into the familiar role. The scapegoat who refuses to continue scapegoating becomes, in this dynamic, the most disruptive force the system has encountered. Not because of anything done, simply by becoming. And this is the point at which the Jungian framework demands something that the simpler version of this narrative does not require. It does not simply validate the person who is growing beyond the family system. It insists that the person who is growing examine their own shadow with the same rigor and the same honesty they are applying to the system they are outgrowing. If this is giving you language for something you've been living without words, if the framework itself is landing in a way that changes how you understand what you're going through, let me know by liking this video. It tells me this depth is worth continuing. The risk that Jung called psychological inflation is one of the most specific and most important shadow dimensions of the individuation from the family identity. And it is one that the popular narratives about breaking free of family systems rarely name. Inflation, in the Jungian sense, occurs when the ego identifies with dimensions of the psyche that are not strictly personal, when the expanding awareness that genuine individuation produces gets confused with transcendence, and the individuating person begins to carry a quality of superiority toward those who are not undergoing the same process. The person who has outgrown the family identity can develop in the shadow of their growth a contempt for the unliberated that is a different form of the same psychological problem they believed they were moving beyond. The genuine individuation of which Jung wrote requires specifically the humility to recognize this risk in oneself. The scapegoat's individuation reveals something about the family system that is both deeply uncomfortable and deeply liberating when it is genuinely understood. The capacity for creative non-conformity that the family could not accommodate, the depth, the questioning, the refusal to accept what was simply given was not simply a problem. It was potential that the family structure had no way to hold except as disruption. When the scapegoat individuates, they are not discovering a new self. They are, for the first time, inhabiting the actual dimensions of who they already were. Dimensions that the family assigned to the shadow, not because they were inherently problematic, but because the system lacked the psychological space for what was genuinely present in this person. The liberation is not from the family, it is from the frame that made the self's actual qualities into its designated pathology. The golden child's individuation has a shadow that is in some respects more difficult to navigate than the scapegoat's, precisely because the family's investment in the golden child is organized around genuine care as much as around projection. The parent who concentrated the family's unlived ambitions in the child, who is now outgrowing that concentration, did not intend harm. They offered what felt like the fullest expression of their love, the transfer of their own most significant hopes. When the golden child begins to individuate, to pursue what is actually their own, rather than what serves the family's projected narrative, the family's experience is not simply resistance. It is bewilderment and grief. And the individuating person's experience includes, specifically, the guilt of withdrawing from a form of love that was genuinely given, however misaligned it may have been with who they actually are. A dimension of the shadow of individuation that is rarely addressed with sufficient directness is the loss that the process genuinely involves, and the grief that accompanies it. The family identity, however limiting, however misaligned with the actual self, was also a container. It provided stability, belonging, and a sense of place within a system that, whatever its dysfunctions, was also the context in which the earliest experiences of being known, however imperfectly, occurred. To move beyond this identity is not simply to gain freedom. It is to lose, at least temporarily, the specific form of belonging it made possible. The grief for this loss is real, and the person who moves through the individuation process without genuinely acknowledging this grief tends to find that it surfaces later, in the recurrent sense that something is missing, in the longing for a belonging that cannot be reconstructed, in the anger that is really sorrow in a more available form. The loneliness of the individuation from the family identity is one of the dimensions of the process that is most consistently underestimated in advance and most consistently confronted in actuality. The participation mystique that the family provided, the embedded sense of being known, of mattering, of having a place in a continuous shared story, does not survive the individuation intact. The individuating person finds themselves, often for extended periods, in a relational no-man's land, no longer fully belonging to the family system they are growing beyond, not yet having built the connections that can hold who they are genuinely becoming. This loneliness is not evidence of having done something wrong. It is a structural feature of genuine individuation. But it is a feature that needs to be named honestly, because unnamed, it tends to produce either a premature return to the family system or a hardening against relatedness itself that is its own form of psychological limitation. Among the most significant grief processes that the individuation from the family identity eventually requires is what might be called the grief for the family you thought you had, or the family you needed and did not receive. This is distinct from anger at what was done or assigned or withheld. It is the grief specific to the moment of clear-eyed recognition, the recognition that the family's limitations were not merely external impositions, but were genuinely limiting, that what the child needed and what the family was capable of providing were, in significant ways, not the same. This recognition, when it arrives with the emotional weight it actually carries, rather than only the intellectual acknowledgement, is one of the most important passages of the individuation from the family. It is also one of the most painful, and it cannot be bypassed without the grief showing up elsewhere, in less recognizable forms. The shadow operates not only in the family's response to the individuating person, and in the suppressed material surfacing from within. It operates also inside the narrative of liberation itself. The story of having outgrown the family, the story that organizes the identity of the one who has grown beyond, can become its own form of constraint. When the individuation is organized primarily around opposition, when the defining movement is away from rather than toward, the family identity remains the organizing principle, just with the valence reversed. The person who defines themselves primarily by having outgrown the family has not yet achieved genuine individuation. They have achieved a reactive identity that is as dependent on the family's presence, psychologically speaking, as the identity it replaced. The genuine individuation is complete only when the family can be held without needing to be either inhabited or opposed. If you are somewhere in this process, past the moment of recognition, but not yet through to the integration, and you sense that there is a layer of this that understanding alone cannot fully move through, I have left something in the first pinned comment. It is for those who are ready to work with this at the level where it actually lives, not just understand it. The Jungian response to the question of what to do with the shadow of individuation from the family begins not with a conversation to have with the family, but with the interior work that must precede any external movement. Before examining what the family system did, what it assigned, what it projected, the work requires an honest examination of what one is projecting onto the family. The ways the family has become, in one's own interior narrative, a container for everything that is not one's own responsibility. The anger that may be, in part, grief. The contempt that may be, in part, inflation. The certainty that may be, in part, the avoidance of complexity. This is not the same as invalidating what the family system genuinely did. It is the prerequisite for engaging it with the clarity that genuine individuation requires, rather than with the unprocessed charge of the shadow material it activated. One of the most practically important distinctions available to the person navigating individuation from the family identity is the distinction between genuine individuation and reactive individuation. Genuine individuation is a movement toward something specific, toward the actual self, toward the psyche's own nature, toward what is genuinely one's own. Reactive individuation is a movement organized primarily by opposition, away from the family's assignments, defined by contrast rather than by authentic direction. The difficulty is that both are frequently present simultaneously in the early stages of the process, and the reactive dimension can be sincerely mistaken for the genuine one. A reliable test. When the family is not in the picture, when the comparison is not available, and the contrast is not providing orientation, what does the direction of growth actually want? What calls from inside rather than pushing from behind? The shadow material that the family identity required the individual to suppress does not integrate automatically once the individuation begins. It surfaces, often in its rawest, least processed form, and must be worked with rather than simply expressed. The person who was required by the family to suppress anger may find, as they individuate, that the anger is suddenly available. But available does not mean integrated. It arrives with the compressed charge of years of unexpression, excessive, disproportionate, attaching itself to situations that do not warrant its full force. The work of integrating the shadow the family assigned is not the permission to express everything that was suppressed. It is the patient, honest examination of that material, feeling what is genuinely there without being governed by it. Here is a dimension of the individuation from the family identity that the liberation narrative frequently obscures. Not everything the family saw was wrong. Every family identity, mixed with its distortions and projections and shadow assignments, contains some genuine perception of the actual person. The responsible one actually carried, in some real dimension, a capacity for care and organization that is genuinely their own. The creative one actually had gifts that the family imperfectly and through its own limited lens recognized. The difficult one actually had a capacity for questioning and refusal that integrated rather than performed reactively becomes genuine discernment. The individuation from the family does not require wholesale rejection of everything the family reflected. It requires the careful discernment of what, within what the family saw, belongs to the actual self, and what was projection. The dream life is one of the most consistent and most underutilized resources available during the individuation from the family identity. While the waking mind is occupied with the conscious dimensions of the process, the interpersonal dynamics, the intellectual understanding, the deliberate navigation, the unconscious is processing the deeper layers through the symbolic language of the dream. Family members appear in dreams not as themselves, but as figures representing the internalized family complex. the psychic structure that continues to operate even when physical proximity to the family has been reduced. Working with these figures as symbols rather than as literal representations of the actual family members is one of the specific practices that Jung identified as valuable for making the individuation from the family complex a genuine interior process rather than merely an interpersonal distance. The double bind that the family system produces grow, but only in ways that do not change who you are to us, cannot be resolved from within the bind itself. It cannot be solved by finding the right way to be both fully oneself and fully what the system needs. It can only be navigated by stepping outside the frame that the bind assumes, the frame in which the system's needs and the individual's genuine development are the relevant pair of terms. What replaces that frame, in the Jungian understanding, is the individual's own developmental logic, the psyche's own orientation toward its fullest expression, as the primary reference point, not the family's needs as the center with the individual's growth as the variable, the individual's genuine nature as the center, with the family's capacity to accommodate it as the variable. Genuine individuation from the family identity eventually produces something that is less dramatic and more psychologically significant than the narratives of liberation suggest: the capacity to hold the family with genuine ambivalence. Not the simple clarity of having escaped something limiting and arrived at something better. Not the ongoing grievance that keeps the family as the organizing reference for everything the individuating person has had to overcome, but the more complex psychological achievement of being able to see simultaneously what the assigned identity cost and what the family also provided, what it genuinely attempted even when it failed, what it built in the person that is worth carrying forward. This ambivalence is not a failure of individuation, it is its specific achievement. And here the process turns from something that is primarily about the family, about what was assigned, what is being released, what is being understood, to something that is fundamentally about what you actually are, about what has been developing in you throughout the entire difficulty of this process, about what becomes available when the identity that was organizing the answer is no longer the one in charge of giving it. The direct conversation with the family, an explicit acknowledgement of the distance between the assigned identity and the actual self, is something that many individuating people consider, and that the Jungian framework does not prescribe. In some families, at the right developmental moment, this conversation is genuinely valuable. It allows both the individual and the family system to make conscious what has been operating implicitly, and it opens the possibility of a relationship organized around who the person actually is. In other family systems, at other developmental moments, the same conversation produces primarily defensive closure and escalated pressure. The relevant question is not whether the conversation should happen, but whether the individual's interior work is far enough advanced that the conversation can come from genuine clarity rather than from the unprocessed charge of the shadow material. What the relationship with the family can become when the individuation is genuine and the interior work has proceeded is not the relationship that preceded the process. That relationship was organized around the assigned identity, and its dissolution is a genuine loss. What becomes possible is something qualitatively different, a relationship organized, to whatever degree the family can accommodate, around who the person actually is. This relationship tends to be less frictionless than the previous one, less organized around the mutual maintenance of an agreed-upon fiction. It is also more real, and it allows a form of genuine encounter with the family, a meeting between actual people rather than between roles, that was not available while the identity assignment was still fully operative on both sides. Jung's observation about the unlived life of the parent is one of the most practically liberating contributions of his framework to the understanding of family dynamics. The portion of the family identity that was organized around what the parent did not achieve, did not become, did not allow themselves, the ambitions transferred, the possibilities projected, the psychological completions assigned, becomes visible as something other than personal when it is understood in this frame. It was not about you. It was never fully about you. It was about the unlived interior of the person who assigned it. This recognition does not produce contempt for the parent. In most cases, it produces something closer to genuine compassion, because it makes visible the limitation and the longing that produced the projection, rather than only the projection itself. What the individuation from the family identity tends to reveal, often as a surprise to the person undergoing it, is the continuity beneath what felt like radical discontinuity. The qualities that surface through the process are not new. They were present throughout, developing in the shadow, circulating in the dream life, breaking through in the moments of most acute discomfort with the assigned persona. The person who emerges from genuine individuation from the family is not a stranger. They are the self that was always there but never fully available, never fully permitted by the conditions that the family identity created. The recognition of this continuity, the sense of having arrived at something one's own rather than having become something alien, is among the most orienting recognitions that the individuation produces. Accepting that some members of the family will never understand the individuation, will never be able to make sense of who the person has become, will never release the earlier narrative of who the person was supposed to be, is one of the specific relinquishments that genuine individuation requires. This acceptance is not resignation. It is the recognition that the family members who cannot follow this development are not failing through malice or indifference. They are limited by the same participation mystique, the same family complex, the same unprocessed shadow material that the individuating person has been working to see clearly. The acceptance does not end the relationship. It ends the hope that the relationship will provide the validation of the individuation that only the individual's own ongoing interior work can actually provide. The quality of the individuating person's encounters with the family changes as the interior work proceeds. Not necessarily the content of the encounters, not necessarily the family's behavior or the topics that can be addressed. What changes is the quality of the person's presence within the encounter. The anxiety that previously accompanied family contact, the anticipatory vigilance, the bracing against reassimilation, begins to diminish as the internal structures of the individuation become more stable. The assigned persona no longer has the same pull. The guilt mechanism no longer operates with the same automatic authority. The individuating person can be genuinely present with the family, can encounter them as they actually are, rather than through the distorting lens of either the previous participation mystique or the reactive opposition that sometimes characterizes the early stages of separation. Integration, in the day-to-day experience of the person who is genuinely individuating from the family identity, does not look like resolution. It does not look like the arrival at a permanent state of clarity in which the family's shadow no longer activates anything. It looks like a gradually increasing capacity to notice what is being activated. The guilt, the pull toward the familiar role, the projection onto the family, without being automatically governed by what is noticed. The observer relationship to the internal dynamics expands. The automatic response is slow. The capacity to choose consciously how to engage with what the family contact produces, rather than simply inhabiting the reaction, becomes more consistently available. This is not a dramatic achievement, it is a quiet one, but it is the specific achievement that the individuation from the family identity produces when it is proceeding genuinely. And what becomes available when this work is genuinely in motion, when the interior has reorganized itself sufficiently that the family identity is no longer what is orienting the answer to who you are, is the beginning of what this process was always moving toward. The life that becomes available as the individuation from the family identity proceeds is distinguished by a specific quality, action from genuine internal direction. The decisions still carry the marks of the history. The habits of the former persona do not vanish overnight, and the family complex continues to activate at certain temperatures. But the organizing center has shifted. The person is no longer primarily responding to the implicit imperatives of the assigned identity. They are responding increasingly to what the actual self actually requires. This is a quiet shift. It does not look dramatic from the outside, but from the inside, the difference between choosing from genuine direction and choosing from the obligations of the assigned role is one of the most significant differences a human being can experience. The contribution that the person who has genuinely individuated from their family identity makes to the broader world, beyond the family system, in their relationships and work and engagement with the collective, is shaped specifically by the difficulty of this process. The qualities that were suppressed by the family identity and recovered through the individuation become the specific substance of what this person can offer. The person whose suppressed emotional depth is now integrated brings a quality of presence to their relationships that comfort could not have produced. The person whose nonconformity has been integrated rather than simply performed brings to their work a quality of genuine originality that reactive opposition never could have sustained. What was shadow becomes the specific gift, not in spite of having been shadow, because of it. There is something that only the person who has navigated the shadow of individuation from the family can genuinely provide to others who are in the middle of the same process. Not advice, not instruction. Something more specific. The quality of presence that comes from having been genuinely inside the difficulty and genuinely through it. The recognition it enables, the ability to see without flinching the complexity and cost of what another person is navigating, cannot be simulated. It is produced by the specific interior territory that this process traverses. The wounded healer principle that Jung articulated extends here. What the process asked of you becomes the precise source of what you can offer. And what you can offer from that place is among the most valuable things available in human relationship. What the individuation from the family identity requires across its full arc, from the first recognition of the discrepancy through the shadow work and the grief and the complex reconfiguration of every relationship the assigned identity organized, is a specific form of interior courage. Not the courage of confrontation, not the courage of declaring oneself free. The quieter and more demanding courage of remaining present with a process that offers no clean resolution, no guaranteed acceptance, no moment at which the complexity simply resolves into the simple clarity that the liberation narrative promises. The courage of becoming without external validation, the courage of continuing the interior work even when it offers, for extended periods, more grief than relief. This is what the process asks, and what it gives in return is proportional to exactly that. The shadow of the individuation from the family, the suppressed qualities, the unacknowledged grief, the inflation that required examination, the loneliness that could not be shortcut, does not remain shadow when it is genuinely encountered and genuinely worked with. It converts. The grief for the family you thought you had becomes the specific capacity for compassion with others who are grieving losses they cannot fully name. The loneliness of the process becomes the foundation for relationships that can hold genuine depth. The shadow material the family assigned becomes, when integrated, the specific resource that only this person, with this history, this wound, this specific interior territory, can bring into the world. The shadow becomes medicine not despite what it was, precisely because of it. Genuine individuation from the family identity is irreversible. A person who has simply endured a difficult period and survived it can, in principle, return to something close to the previous configuration. A person who has been genuinely transformed by the shadow work of individuation cannot. The shadow material that was integrated cannot be unintegrated. The persona shadow split that was made conscious cannot return to being unconscious in quite the same way. The family complex that was examined continues to be examinable rather than simply automatic. This irreversibility is not a trap. It is a form of permanence that the assigned identity, however stable it appeared, never actually had. What the individuation builds cannot be revoked by any change in external circumstances, because it is not located in the circumstances. It is located in the self. The individuation that has brought you to this point of recognition, to the ability to see the family identity as an assigned structure rather than as simply who you are, did not begin when you first consciously identified it. It began long before. In the persistent interior sense that you were more than what the family story allowed. In the recurring discomfort with the persona that was performing so successfully. In the dreams that would not stay quiet about dimensions of experience the waking identity was organized to exclude. In the relationships and encounters that opened what the family's world had no category for. In the suffering that revealed an interior depth the persona was never designed to hold. All of this was individuation already in motion. You were already becoming who you are before you had the name for the process or the framework to understand it. The relationship with the family at its best, after genuine individuation, after the shadow work and the grief and the complex reorganization, becomes something that neither the previous participation mystique nor the reactive opposition of the early individuation could have produced. It becomes a relationship between actual people, partial, imperfect, shaped by the history and the limits of what the family system can accommodate, but organized to whatever degree is genuinely possible, around encounter with who each person actually is, rather than around the mutual maintenance of assigned roles. Not every family can reach this. Not every family will. But for those that can, the relationship available on the other side of genuine individuation carries a quality of realness that the family's most comfortable periods, organized around the shared performance of the assigned identities, never had. What the Jungian framework exacts from the person who engages it seriously on this question or any other is honesty. Not the honesty that is easy, not the honesty that confirms what was already believed, but the honesty that turns the same quality of examination onto the self that it applies to the system being examined. Jung's framework does not simply validate the one who individuates and pathologize the family that resists. It insists that the individuation is genuine only when it includes the shadow work, the examination of one's own projections, one's own inflation, one's own grief that has not been fully felt. What the framework gives in return for that honesty is equally precise. A map of the interior that is more accurate and therefore more navigable than any simpler account of this process provides. The life that was always yours, the directions that were always genuinely your own, the qualities that were always present beneath the assigned persona, the relationships and work and engagement with the world that are organized around what you actually are rather than around what you were assigned to be, was not produced by the individuation from the family identity. It was revealed by it. The process did not create something new. It cleared the space for what was always there. And the recognition of this, of having arrived through one of the most demanding interior journeys the psyche undertakes, at something that was yours before the family's assignment began, is perhaps the most orienting recognition the entire process produces. It was always yours. The individuation was simply the path back to it. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, "I am becoming who I was always meant to be," and I've placed another lesson on your screen right now that continues exactly where this one ends. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.